Welcome back to our show, the American Family Association. Tonight we're discussing what's wrong with the New York State Legislature. Mike?
Thank you, Patty. So, Frank, we were just talking right before we went to the break about the consequences, the financial consequences that maybe people hadn't considered beyond the moral of same-sex marriage. You were going to
One final point. Yeah, marriage is all about the children. That's what people forget. Dr. Jennifer Robach-Morse, an economics professor at Yale University, made this so clear. That's the only reason for centuries, for millennia, that society, civilized society, has given marriage special rights and protection. It's for the interests of the children, to protect the children, because they do best with a mother and a father. And that's why they built up marriage. That's the only reason. So homosexuals cannot procreate.
Well, we want to stay along the theme of finance. There's been some discussion in recent days or in recent weeks, published reports about how the New York State Pension Fund has been holding up through these recent difficult economic times, and what are the consequences for taxpayers that they should be, understanding at this juncture?
Yeah, New York State is in an incredibly dangerous situation. We're facing a deficit of close to $50 billion over the next 3 years. $50 billion.
But
pension funds.
I want to put it in perspective for our viewers. I believe that the New York State Employees Pension Fund had a balance of about $150 billion, and it lost over $50 billion in the recent market downturn, or close to it. It's somewhere around $104 billion or something like that.
Well, it was the basic state retirement system was $150 billion. It lost about $45 billion. The teachers' retirement system was about $100 billion. I believe that lost close to $30 billion. You put these together, you're talking about a loss of over $70 billion in our pension systems. And
by one analyst evaluation, S&P lost 38% for the year of 2008, and yet these funds, I believe, were down close to 50%.
No, not that much. I think they were down, I would say 30% in that order, percentage-wise. All right.
I'll go back and check.
Okay. Pretty sure they were down in the order of 25 to 30-something percent. It's the same percentage loss, but the problem is this has to be made up now by the taxpayers. And so in the near term, not this year, but come 2010 actually, October 2010 with the school districts, and then 2011 with the state and the county and the towns, we're going to have to make up any remaining losses. Now, some of these losses hopefully maybe will be recovered, but to whatever extent there are losses, and I expect it to be in the tens of billions of dollars, the taxpayers are going to have to make this up. This is a terrible, terrible burden. All private companies are now, not all, but most are moving away from benefits that are paid 100% by the employer. They're going to shared responsibilities. And I think that's what we've got to do here. If they still want to have it managed by the government or managed in some safer way than the individual, I'll leave that up to them. But the point is today, teachers put in 3% a year for 10 years. The cost, roughly, it depends on how the economy does, but on average over the past 30 years, it required about a 10% contribution per year every year they work. So if they put in 3% only for 10 years, and they work 30 years or 35 years, it winds up that teachers are only paying, school employees are only paying about 6% of their total pension costs. Taxpayers are paying 94%. For the other government employees, some of them pay nothing. So I mean, the taxpayers are paying between 90 and 95% of pension costs. Same thing for health costs. We're paying between 80% and 100% of health costs. These costs are going through the roof.
Right, but again, the 80 to 100%, meaning that we're not requiring the teachers to make any contributions in some instances, where in the private sector, many people, it's well acknowledged, will pay 10, 15, maybe even 20% of their overall health care costs in an effort to defray their employers.
Even more than that.
Even more.
Yeah, teachers are paying as much as, I'd say, 20%, 23, 24%.
Some, not all.
No. On the average, I'd say it's about 10 to 12% on average. In our school district, we got them up to 20%. But I'd like to see them get up closer to a 50-50 split for both pensions and health insurance costs, because that would also have the added advantage of making public employees pick more prudently between health plans. Maybe one that has a higher copay and is more carefully structured in terms of how much it'll pay, what kind of services, how often, and so forth. When it's paid by the taxpayers 90, 95%, they want the best possible one because they don't have to pay for it. Yeah. And the taxpayers cannot. It's a crisis facing us of monumental proportions.
But help our viewers understand that, because I don't think people always get, when people say the word unsustainable, what it means really is that there's not enough money to meet all of these requirements, that we're on a collision course with bankruptcy. And should the state go bankrupt, as the state of California is struggling now The state of New Jersey may be close behind it, with New York winning the bronze medal, coming in third. That failure to be able to meet or support these things has a consequence, meaning at that point that there are some real serious ramifications.
Those are the three most troublesome states. You're absolutely right. New Jersey, California, and New York. Yet we've got to do something on this because, just as an example, something like New York City, and maybe just be Manhattan, out of some, I think, 400,000 families, there are like 4,000 or so. We have 1% that are paying 50% of the taxes. So I mean, as you raise taxes, and the inclination is to raise it on what they call the wealthy, these people are not stupid. They're going to make a decision of, why should I stay in New York? And so if these people leave, the tax burden on the remaining people goes up disproportionately. So you could lose just 0.5% of the population, and taxes could go up 50%. If they're paying half the taxes and half of those people leave, your taxes will go up, well, 25%. It's an astronomical impact. And that's the message that New York State is sending people in New York State, that their tax costs, their spending is going through the roof to such a point that people have got to be crazy or obligated in some way to stay here. And if they've got any opportunity to leave, they're going to leave, and that's exactly what's happening. People are leaving New York State.
By what type of numbers are we looking at?
Well, there are 3 people leaving for every 2 that come in. When you exclude immigration, just people who are with citizens of the United States, 3 people leave the state for every 2 that come in.
I hadn't heard that. That's
Oh
amazing.
yeah, that's a number. And percentage-wise, I think Rhode Island might be worse than us, but other than that, in absolute numbers, we're losing more people than any other state. And the people that are leaving are the ones who would be creating the jobs because they're being hit disproportionately with the higher taxes. So we've got to deal with out-of-control spending. And the problem is our politicians in both parties are terrified of our public employee unions. New York State is controlled by our public employee unions, school unions.
You mean the legislature and the governor?
Yes, the legislature, the government. They're terrified of our NYS, the New York State United Teachers, the state employee unions, the police unions, and again, city police clearly are not overpaid in my judgment.
No.
They have a rough job.
They do.
They're paid maybe $65,000, $70,000. The suburban police are making $120,000 for a much easier job. They get pensions of $100,000. They're getting enormous time off per year. They're not working as much as private industry people do in a number of days and so forth. Again, my father-in-law was a retired policeman. I have 5 teachers in the family. I'm not anti-police. I'm not anti-teacher. But I'm simply saying that we've got to start balancing things. And I'm not talking about certain government workers are not overpaid. Most government workers, in all honesty, are not overpaid. But in the suburban areas, teachers and police are receiving salaries that are not warranted by the market. There are so many people, 100 people, more than 100, 100 and 200 people who want each of those police and teacher jobs. And even if only half of them are qualified, well qualified, that's still 50 people or 100 people well qualified for those jobs. So the market's saying we don't have to raise these salaries to the levels they've been raised. We've got laws in New York on binding arbitration, which keeps shifting the police course between Nassau and Suffolk. They each compare themselves to the other county, and they keep hop-skipping over one another. We've got to eliminate binding arbitration. Tom Suozzi made a bad mistake in going to binding arbitration voluntarily for one of these.
He campaigned on that he would go against that. Then he got into office and he flipped.
And he did it. He went, and it was a bad decision. It gave that the decisions by these binding arbitrators. They know the unions are the sharper ones. They know that if they don't kowtow to the unions, they won't get picked to be the final arbitrator in these decisions. So binding arbitration is not good. We've got to get our legislature to stand up for the taxpayers and the people. Personally, I don't think they're going to do it. I think New York State is really going to be facing more serious problems down the road, is my personal guess.
It does seem like a lost cause in many ways,
does
that's
seem
for
like a
sure.
lost cause.
You raised the important point of education dollars and the number of applicants for teaching positions and the high salaries in the suburbs, particularly here on Long Island. And it's ironic because every year people go out and vote for an increase in teacher salaries in passing the school budget. Actually, a lot of people don't even go and vote. They just don't vote at all. So it's ironic that people are complaining about their high taxes, but they're inadvertently causing them to go up.
That's true, and in all honesty, 85% of people don't vote in the school elections typically. 15% vote, and I'd say about a third of them are school employees. But the problem is also partly the state legislature again, because even if you defeat a budget, it's going to go up by as much as 4%. I just saw in the South Huntington School District a letter that they sent out using taxpayer money. They sent it out and they said the proposed budget is X% increase. the taxes are going to go up 2.9%. Then they said, however, if you defeat the budget, now the budget would have to go down by law. It would go from, say, 3% down to 2% by law. But they said the tax increase will go from 2.9% to 5.2%. And legally, I think they could do that, because what they said they would do was, we're going to take money that we were going to use from our reserve funds, from our fund balances, and apply it to keep your taxes lower. But if you defeat the budget, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep that money for next year, and your tax rate increase will be 5.2 instead of 2.9.
So is it fair to say?
Crazy. This is New York state law permitting this.
Is it fair then to communicate to our viewers at home, we as taxpayers are essentially the boss, and yet we're not demonstrating any control over the people that purport to be responsible for what we put them in charge to do, whether it's teaching, whether it's any of the other industries that are serviced here in New York through the state. We are allowing this to go on. So your point, I think, illustrates the frustration people should have with this issue. It's created really out of indifference.
It's not even, I don't want to say indifference.
Well, if people
apathy,
don't vote,
yeah.
if people don't vote
Yeah.
and don't take the time out to read about their issues in the community, we're all busy. But our indifference.
But it's not only the school elections, it's who they're electing to the legislature, because the legislature sets up the contingency budget law. They set up the situation that allows a school district to do what South Huntington was going to do. What they said, in fact, what might be illegal was that in saying this in a newsletter, telling people that if you defeat the budget, the tax increase will be like 60% higher than if you pass it.
Correct.
They're using taxpayer money, in effect, to almost convey a message: you better vote for this budget. Which, you know, to me,
It's objectionable.
yeah. But the fact that New York state law would allow them to do that, to alter how much of the balanced funds, the reserve funds they use, that's disgraceful. So the problem is the legislature and the people in New York State are really, I guess you have to say, at fault in electing, but both parties. That's another part of the problem. Both parties are to blame. I'd say the Democrats are a little worse than the Republicans, but the Republicans in the Senate had a great opportunity to change things. They failed to do it. Both parties are to blame. It's a sad state of affairs.
An interesting statistic to share with our viewers and with both you and Patty. I believe I read somewhere where if you go back to the 1970s, something like 100 of the Fortune 500 corporations were headquartered here in New York City. And by the time we got to the end of the 1980s, it was down to 65. And by the time we got into the 1990s, it was 38. And somewhere recently, we are now in the 20s.
Wow.
Now,
says
the
a lot.
point being is financial services is what has driven many or supplied the state of New York government with income. The state of financial services is decimated currently. There used to be 43 primary dealers, or 42 going back 10 years ago. Today there is only 15. And a number of them, due to the fact that the internet and the way the marketplace has expanded in terms of using technology, they no longer need to be in New York. Some of them are locating in Richmond, Virginia. They're locating in places like Delaware now. They're going to other parts of the country to operate, and they're no longer centric to New York. And I don't think our elected leaders, both parties, get that.
Well, even if they do get it, I think they, to some extent, understand some of this, but the unions are so powerful and the voters are so disorganized. I mean, what we really need to see is some candidates running from either party. I like Steve Levy, who's a Democratic county executive in Suffolk. He's one of the ones on fiscal issues.
I'm a Republican. I love Steve Levy because he's a monetarist. He's working for the taxpayer.
He speaks the truth. He's one of the few I see speaking the truth. We need some other people of that, both Republicans and Democrats, to run for office and make it clear. Folks, it's time to choose between the public employee unions and the taxpayers. I mean, I don't want to hurt. I want to be fair to the public employees. And again, in this New York City, to be honest, the teachers there and the policemen there are not overpaid, in my judgment.
No, they're not.
The proof is because they don't have that many applicants applying for
No, but
those
then
jobs.
you were raising the issue earlier about the Long Island Railroad. 90 to 95% of the people that were retiring from the Long Island Railroad were doing so claiming a disability that they either did not have or couldn't support.
And I don't know where that stands right now. Now, what is their solution? They raised fares 10% this year. They're going to raise them again in 2 years,
10%
another 15%.
was more than that. It was ridiculous.
They're raising the MTA fares. They're doing all sorts. They're raising business taxes, further hurting small businesses. So they're doing the wrong things instead of dealing with the abuses by public employee unions. And again, it's not the members. It's the union leaders, and I guess they're figuring in order to keep getting elected, they've got to make a certain number of people happy, which means more money for less work.
There's so much waste.
There's so much waste in our public institutions in New York State. Unless it's dealt with, the crisis is going to be unmanageable.
But this highlights what I was saying earlier. There is a level of indifference in our electorate We have some of the lowest voting rates of all time now. There is a complacency, and it's sickening because you are illustrating so many fine points that people need to understand, and yet what does it say to you that we have a governor whose father is a former elected official who now openly works as a lobbyist? There have been fine, excellent reports in the New York Post that have illustrated this unholy alliance of where the governor is passing legislation to support his constituents, not the taxpayer. And the thing is, this has been going on for a couple of years now since the governor took office, and it flies in the face of reality that we would even think about supporting him, letting alone all the other people that support this operation.
My problem, Mike, is that it's not only Governor Patterson and Governor Spitzer, but it was Governor Pataki, the Republicans. The Republicans were almost as bad, I'd say as bad as the Democrats. They failed to address these problems. Dean Skelos, Republican leader in the Senate, year after year after year after year, for as far back as I can remember, and his predecessor, Joe Bruno, I take that back. He was only leader for a couple of years, or a year or so. But his predecessor, Joe Bruno, the Republican, they failed to deal with the public employee union problems of health benefits, pension costs, numbers of employees. They failed to deal with it. They were all terrified of the unions. And until you see some candidates get up, like Steve Levy, or some good Republicans like Faso. John Faso, I think, was pretty good. You get a good Republican like Faso, a good Democrat like Steve Levy, coming out and making it clear to the people, and maybe they're going to be frightened to do it, folks, it's time to choose between the public employee unions and the taxpayers. Well, you got to choose, and that means the unions are going to go viciously against these people. Will the voters act? That's the point.
Well, I would like to just make two distinctions before I turn it back over to Patty, because you raised a couple excellent points. Full disclosure, as a registered Republican, I chose to attack the governor. I do not discount the stuff that went on under the Pataki administration. However, and I would also add that I totally in agreement, Frank, when you bring up Joe Bruno. Joe Bruno is continuing, I believe he's under federal investigation now, and he stepped down as the majority leader. The thing that I would beckon all our elected officials to is they got to come back and reorient themselves that the taxpayers cannot support what is currently in place. We are on a collision course. The corporate world cannot support New York State's chronic need to fill the coffers of all these unions. And if these unions truly were in need of all of this money, compensation-wise, then why is there so much waste, as illustrated in the Long Island Railroad? Why is there so much waste that we continue to see in so many different parts? That's the part that's hurting the state. We are not efficient. We're not competitive.
And we need ordinary people. You know, I'm a leader in the Conservative Party. I'm not even that pleased with my own party. I think they're more principled than the Republicans and Democrats, but we have a high number of people who run the Conservative Party who have jobs with the government. Doesn't mean that they're doing things wrong necessarily, but very often they're going to have to make decisions, and if it jeopardizes their job, they're going to do what the boss says or whatever they have to do to keep their job and their family safe. So we have to change some of the basic rules governing the politicians in all parties. Maybe we should have some kind of rule that says if you are a direct family member, work for a county or a town or a city or state government, you are not allowed to be on the executive committee of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or the Working Family or Conservative Party.
Because of the conflict of interest.
Because of the conflict of interest. You can't then be expected to put your family at risk. It's understandable, but that's what's happening. So the basic people in the Republican Democratic Party, I'd say 95% are in it because they either work for the government or they're doing it for business concerns and connections. And in the minor parties, the Working Families, Conservative, maybe it's 50%, not 95%, but it's 50%. We have to get more people who are in it for principle and who will act on the basis of principle. Personally, I don't think it's going to happen. That's just my sad prognosis.
And you tend to be very optimistic, but the situation...
I'm more sanguine. I'm more sanguine. I agree with Frank, and I guess my disgust is at all of them, but I am hopeful because of the fact that this is a different time now. We are not, the state is struggling, the city is struggling, financial services is struggling, the economy is weak. It's not likely to change under the current administration and the federal government, all due respect. Policies are limited in what they can do. And people have to start living within their means. We're all doing it in our homes. Why can't the government do the same?
But even if you're living within your means, you only have so much money left after you pay the exorbitant taxes. And it's mind-boggling to hear how many people are leaving the state. I didn't realize it was
when businesses start leaving the state and the jobs go behind them, what are the people going to do in their absence?
Right.
They either stay or they have to leave. If they stay, they're taking a job at a lower pay or a different career. And I just don't think our elected officials understand this. They fail to understand it.
It brings to mind the main reason, Frank, that you started doing this show years ago here on our 300th show, the breakdown of the family.
Right.
And the increase in all these expenses and the taxes causes the second spouse to have to go out to work, or the first spouse to take on a second job or a third job, and there's so much pressure on the family. And then they're putting money into public education that is failing their children, and they can't get school choice to go through, so they can send their child to the private school. And I think the show is so important, and shows like this, because the mainstream media is not bringing out a lot of these issues. Every time there's a school budget vote, the local papers, Newsday, the town papers, New York Times, they are pushing for all the school budgets to pass. And the average person is thinking, well, that will just automatically mean better education for my child.
Sure.
They either vote to increase it or they don't vote at all. So I think that's why it's so important to get the word out there and to educate people. But just moving briefly to another topic, what about the funding for health care for state and local employees? Where is that right now in the state?
Another major problem. We're spending somewhere between $12,000 and $15,000 per employee. It's paid somewhere between 80 and 100% by the taxpayers. We've got to change that. We've got to move to a system that's more 50-50. That'll make the choices they pick more prudent, and it'll help the taxpayers. But it's something that the politicians are afraid to do. And you mentioned the school choice issue just before, Patty. I mean, that is one simple thing that if we moved towards giving parents choice in education with tax credits or scholarships equal to, say, a third or at most a half of the cost of a public school education.
We'd save a fortune.
We would say, based on a study done by the New York State Senate back in the early 90s, for the New York State Senate by Ron Lauder, printed in the New York Times and Newsday and elsewhere. Back then, we'd save $4 billion with a full parental choice system. Now, 18 years later, we would save $10 billion a year. That is monumental. $10 billion plus improve the quality of education by giving parents choice, especially helping middle-income and low-income parents to pick a school that they view as best for their children. But the reason we'll never see this in New York, we got these Blaine amendments, which people are not even familiar with, in 35 states. They have a history in anti-Catholicism. Liberals and conservatives both acknowledge it. Professor Joe Vitariti of NYU Law School has written about it. It's been written about by many, many experts in academia. The Blaine amendments have a history in anti-Catholicism started by these nativist people in the 1850s, 1860s, and so forth. We have that amendment, the Blaine Amendment in New York, which makes it difficult to introduce tax credits or scholarships for school choice. So we've got to deal with the Blaine Amendment, which may be dealt with in the Supreme Court at some time, the U.S. Supreme Court, because of its anti-religious aspects. But the other part is the powerful teacher unions. The teacher unions are controlling, and other unions, but the teachers union in particular controls New York State and their politicians. And they want to keep their educational monopoly. In Port Washington, I just got the data. Recent retirees in Port Washington, retiring in 2008, got pensions averaging $75,000, and they don't have to pay state income taxes on it. That's the teacher's retirement. Their salaries in Port Washington, $100,000 is the median salary in Port Washington in 2009.
And it's these same teacher unions that want to suppress the fact that the Catholic schools, the private schools, are doing a better job for far less money per pupil.
Well, I would say in Long Island they're doing as good a job. In New York City, they're doing a far better job. In New York City, for about half the cost, they're doing a better job than the public schools. That's clear. The studies show that. In Long Island,
results.
I haven't seen, there's really no comparative qualitative data, but it looks like they're doing comparable jobs. But the religious schools are doing it for 1/3 the cost of the public schools. Public schools spend $20,000. Take out the special needs costs, it's $18,000, because that's not fair to add that in. So $18,000 per pupil. In Port Washington, we're spending $24,000, but say $18,000. In the Catholic schools, it's typically $6,000. $5,500 maybe for elementary, $7,500, $8,000 for high school. That's weighing in all the costs. They're doing it for much, much less. Everybody would benefit. Students would benefit. Parents would benefit. And the taxpayers would benefit. But the teachers union wants to keep their monopoly, their current monopoly.
Do our elected officials realize, though, that we're at a tipping point, that given the combination of the bad economy and the fact that many people who put their children into private schools do so out of pocket, knowing that they're already funding the local public school system, so they're paying twice, in effect, and we're at a point now where, due to the economy, people
they're
are
going to take their kids out of the private
Correct.
schools, and it's going to rise the public school taxes more.
Correct.
It's a crisis. I think they realize it, but I think.
Are
the
they going to
typical
take action?
I think not. I think the
because the
typical one is
Catholics-
going to, yeah, they're looking to their retirement, so they can get their retirement pension.
They're gonna
They just
wimp
want to
out.
survive a few more years,
But even
get
if-
elected, and they're going to get elected because the nature of our voters is to re-elect 98% of our assemblymen and senators every year. The black people have, poll after poll shows our black citizens want school choice. They're unhappy with their failing public schools, whether it's on Long Island or in New York City. They want school choice, yet who do they vote for? They vote for these Democrats, black Democrats, who cater to the teacher unions. So who do you blame there? Why are black voters who want school choice voting for not all black politicians? I'll say Malcolm Smith, I see he's good. There's a congressman, I forget his name, down in the South Shore in Queens. There are a lot of good, even Governor Patterson has good instincts on the school choice issue, but the typical politician in Albany kowtows to the teacher unions, terrified of the public school teacher unions, doesn't care what the impact is on taxpayers or on students. And I don't think the voters are aware of this.
I think it needs to be said, and I know I say it over and over again, but the New York State taxpayer, whether he or she has a child in private school, particularly in the Catholic school system, the New York State taxpayer currently in the year 2009 enjoys a $7 to $8 billion benefit because
That's correct.
private schools, the Catholic school system is funding that out of pocket, and thus if it collapses, it's not $9 billion on the taxpayers.
It's more.
It's $18 billion
Right,
because you
right.
have to factor in the cost of public school education.
right.
So those costs are higher, meaning here we are, we're talking about all of these costs. We're outlining the fact that we have healthcare costs that are unsustainable, let alone educational costs. We're now at the tipping point, in my opinion, where we're looking at inviting the very calamity we're alleged to try to avoid.
We need to see politicians who will do the right thing. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that. It's so sad to say, because these are good, they're not bad people, most of them, but they're putting their self-interests ahead of what their obligation is to the community.
They
and
get
to the
into the
people.
system and then they're voted in, it's the
And I think
status
they
quo.
start out with the right motives. I think most people get into politics justly motivated. I think so. And as time goes on, they get their relatives' jobs, their friends' jobs, and now suddenly if they continue to do certain things, then the unions or whoever has influence over them will penalize them and their friends. And so they start kowtowing to these unions, these public
What would be
employee
the
unions.
first thing that you would recommend that would make a huge difference in New York State? Would it be the school
Oh,
choice
yeah.
issue?
If we went to providing, with the Educational Tax Incentive Act, would be a baby step forward. That's been proposed 12 years in a row. It gives a huge tax credit if you donate to public schools or private schools. So public schools win. Private schools win. Everybody wins.
Competition.
But even though the public schools get more money, the teacher unions are opposed. Why are they opposed? Because they don't like the idea that it's helping the private schools stay open. The public school teacher unions want the private schools to close to give the public school unions more jobs.
We only have a couple of minutes, but I thought maybe you could summarize for our viewers what you believe the prioritized factors contributing to the current abysmal fiscal picture that the state of New York faces, in your opinion, and what can they do about it? What do you
would
recommend?
cause the fiscal crisis, or
What are
The
the
main
factors?
factors.
Summarize the main factors, and what do you recommend?
well, it's health care, and the health costs and educational costs are the bulk of our New York State tax budget. In Medicaid, we know the fraud ranges from anywhere from $5 to $18 billion a year.
Annually.
The estimates range all over the place per year. The look-back period, for instance, a lot of people, they have a sick parent. What they do is they take all their resources, transfer it, and then at some point, they've extended the look-back period, I think, to 5 years. They move their parent to a nursing home where they don't get as good a care as they would get if they were at home. So we've got to change. There are a lot of problems we got to deal with: education, health care, the public employee union benefits in every field. We've got to deal with it.
That's
And
overwhelming.
Yeah, in certain areas in the city, again, New York City, to be honest, I don't think it's as problematic as it is in the suburbs. But those are the basic issues that I see as causing our state fiscal crisis, and it looks like we're not going to be able to
We
resolve
only
it.
have a few seconds left, but what do you think are the chances for school choice going through anytime soon in the state? What are the prospects?
Well, vouchers or scholarships, unlikely. Tax credits, maybe by the Educational Tax Incentive Act, which benefits public schools as well. I'd say it's a 1 in 3 shot if we could elect the right people. If Malcolm Smith, the Senate leader, and Shelley Silver and Patterson, but I think they're going to be frightened by the teacher unions. That's my guess, is they're going to back off, and they're not going to even do something that is obviously beneficial to public schools and private schools.
It's like night and day.
It
Thank
is.
you so much, Frank, and congratulations again on the 300th program. and to my co-host Mike Mulhall. Thank you to our viewers for watching our program tonight. We hope to see you again next week. We hope we've had a very interesting program for you this evening.
This program was brought to you by the American Family Association of New York. If you'd like to receive AFA's free newsletter, write us at P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York, 11050, or call us at 516-944-3544. Our newsletter and TV schedule are on our website at www.afany.org. Your comments are welcome, and thanks for being with us.